a basic tenet of liberalism in the period after the Second World War, really through the 1960s into the early 1970s, is that America is basically a good society. The problems that African Americans are facing is one that comes from exclusion. That essentially, if Black people are included into the same institutions that have produced this enormous white middle class after the Second World War, then those institutions can play the same role in Black communities. So the problem is exclusion, and all we need is inclusion. And the problem for that outlook is that it doesn't actually allow us to understand the institutions that we are suggesting Black people be integrated into. And so from the purview of housing, the problems with this idea of just shifting from exclusion to inclusion become very clear. And so I describe the inclusion of African Americans into conventional real estate practices and mortgage banking as predatory. And it's really a way to understand how the previous period impacts the contemporary moment, meaning that the decades of disinvestment, of racist exclusion of African Americans from the conventional real estate market, create a tremendous amount of distress in Black communities. It is at the root of substandard housing in Black communities. And those become the basis upon which, even when African Americans are included, for them to be treated differently, for them to be seen as more risky. And the whole notion of risk gives the banks and real estate industry an excuse to charge African Americans more, to subject them to less secure banking methods, all of which end up putting African Americans in making them vulnerable to new predatory practices that aren't exactly like the previous examples, like the use of contracts in lieu of conventional mortgages. In Chicago is one example. So they're not quite that way, but it means that African Americans have to rely on unregulated mortgage banks as opposed to commercial banks with better interest rates and a better situation overall. So it's really trying to look critically at the institutions and practices themselves, and not just whether or not African Americans are present and able to actively participate. We need to look at the institutions themselves and the practices themselves to determine whether or not this is the best way to increase social mobility for Black people.